Hello, we're going to get started with tonight's webinar. Thanks for joining us. This is the Michigan State University Beekeeping Office Hours. This is an MSU Extension program. And we will start off with some quick introductions. So my name's Anna Heck. I'm an apiculture extension educator at Michigan State University. Megan, do you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Megan Milbrath, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Entomology at Michigan State University.
Dan?
Dan Wines, I'm the farm manager at the Pollinator Performance Center on South Campus. Look after our campus bees and facility.
Great, and Chris?
Yeah, I'm Chris Bardenhagen, farm business management educator for basically northern lower Michigan.
Fantastic. All right, so here's the agenda we have set out for tonight. So we'll start off with some announcements. Then Chris Bardenhagen is going to talk about the Corporate Transparency Act. Dan's going to talk about installing new colonies and spring feeding. Megan's covering dealing with deadouts. I'll talk about reversals and space and Varroa. And then we'll have lots of time for questions and answers. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we look forward to answering them. So we'll get started here with announcements. So I compiled all of the links that we're mentioning in tonight's webinar at this link. So if you go to the link, if you type it into your browser, or if you use the QR code, I think we'll also be able to put it in the chat here. That's going to give you a page where you'll see all of the links mentioned in the announcements and through the resources. And it's also where we'll post the recording of tonight's webinar. I'll leave it up for another second, but this is your chance to find where we are posting all of the links from the webinar. All right. Now I'm just excited to talk about things that we're excited about. So one of them is this really cool new resource that we developed as part of some grants we have to train veterinarians in honeybee medicine. It's the diagnostic tools for honeybee medicine, and it's on our website. And if you go to beesneedvets.com or go to our website and find our veterinary resources, you'll find this diagnostic tool, and it goes through lots of different honeybee issues and then visual signs of these issues and ways to do field tests or to diagnose them. And it looks really awesome because the people who put it together have very nice skills in making things look awesome. We're really excited about this resource. We think it's going to be really helpful in getting veterinarians, veterinary students, veterinary technicians up to speed and working with honeybees and helping to support beekeepers. But we also think it's going to be a really useful tool for many beekeepers who want to understand these diseases better and how to diagnose them. So check that out. All right. Another new resource we have is our online course called Is Beekeeping Right for Me? So if you know anyone who's trying to decide if beekeeping is a good fit for them, feel free to send them to our online course. And we go through some of the considerations of whether or not it makes sense for someone to become a beekeeper based off of their interests and capacities and time. All right, we compile many resources for getting started with beekeeping in Michigan on this webpage. So if you want to just resource for yourself, are there people in your bee club or other beekeepers, you can check out this webpage, and it has a bunch of links and educational opportunities. All right, we have our YouTube channel. This spring, we did a few webinars in coordination with the Michigan Beekeepers Association Spring Conference. So we had some guest presenters. We have some webinar recordings on our YouTube channel, as well as recordings from last year's office hours webinars. We always like to remind people about our local beekeeping clubs. Here in Michigan, we have about 30 beekeeping clubs that provide a lot of education and support for beekeepers. So make sure you find your local clubs if you haven't already. All right, and then we have our events page on our website. We have some nice upcoming events that we want to share. So first of all, this is the first of the office hours webinar series. We'll be meeting monthly through September. So you can join and plan to have a similar kind of experience where we'll share seasonal beekeeping management, and then you'll have lots of time to ask us your questions. All right, we are also planning some in-person and hive beekeeping workshops, and registration for those will open soon. MSU Science Festival is the month of April, and as part of Science Festival, we are hosting an open house at the Pollinator Performance Center. So the open house will be April 13th, which is a Saturday, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. So if you want to see where we work, the Pollinator Performance Center, this is your chance to join us for an open house. All right, and then if you want to make sure that you're staying connected and getting emails about our upcoming events and our resources, you can sign up for the MSU Extension News Digest. We are the pollinators and pollination category. And then we also have Ask Extension. So if you live in Michigan and you have beekeeping questions or other questions related to extension, you can use the Ask Extension form on our website to send us your questions. I'm really excited to have Chris Bardenhagen here to talk about the Corporate Transparency Act. So as Chris said, he's part of MSU Extension's farm business team, and there's a lot beekeepers can learn from this team. And one of those things is about the Corporate Transparency Act. So this is going to be relevant to many of our beekeepers. Chris, I'll let you take it from here.
All right, thanks, Emma. Yeah, so I appreciate the opportunity to let's see. Hold on one second, make sure my screen is going. Actually, it's not working, so I'll just say next slide.
Okay.
So yeah, and you can go to the next slide even. Yeah, so I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Corporate Transparency Act because we are actively trying to get the word out for people that need to file. So yeah, just a little bit of background. What is the act? So at its core, it's an anti-money laundering law. So it's not anything new. Actually, it's been years in the coming. Our United States signed on to certain international agreements something like 20 years ago that are now finally getting fulfilled or attempted to be fulfilled by this act. So the idea is making it harder for bad actors to hide assets, hide illegal funds and things like that. And so if it's done internationally, people can't jump country to country to do their money laundering. So that's the idea behind the whole thing. What does it require? It requires reporting of beneficial ownership information. So a beneficial owner is somebody who has 25% or more ownership or interest in the company or has substantial control over a business. So if someone has 15%, but they call all the shots, they would be considered having substantial control and would want to report as a beneficial owner. Next slide, please. So who must file? Most business entities will have to file. So LLCs, including single member LLCs, are not exempt, even though for tax purposes, single member LLCs are sort of disregarded. The law does not exempt them, so you do have to file. So S Corps, C Corps, LLCs, cooperatives, many nonprofit associations have to file. So the exceptions, the biggest exception, the most relevant is that sole proprietorships do not have to file. And the reason there is there's no entity that can potentially be used to shield assets. So sole proprietors just report their income and such through their tax returns, and so that's all fine. So they don't need to file for the Corporate Transparency Act. Another big exception is the 501c3 tax exempt nonprofits. Those are exempt, but many nonprofits are not tax exempt. So yeah, if you have a nonprofit association that's not tax exempt, I would suggest contacting your attorney if you're executive director or something like that. And it should be a pretty quick and hopefully inexpensive communication, but you want to get that filed correctly. So I would recommend that. So another exemption is larger businesses. So if you have more than 20 United States employees and more than 5 million in the United States in sales in the United States, then you're also, that business is also exempt, but again, that's you work with your attorney to make sure all your stuff is properly done or make sure it doesn't need to be done. Next slide, please. Okay, so when to file? So existing businesses, meaning businesses that were around before January 1st, 2024, need to file by January 1st, 2025. So we've been given a year to file. New businesses, when they're formed, need to be registered within 30, or need to be filed within 30 days of official registration. Now, quick note, that's 30 days of registration, not 30 days of notice of registration. So paper filers beware. If you get your paper documents from the Department of State, from Laura, you may only have a week or two to go ahead and file. So if for changes in beneficial ownership information, again, it's within 30 days of the change. So that would be like a new CEO or shareholder acquiring more than 25%. Often those are things that might be done year end, but in any event, make sure to report those within 30 days of the change. Next slide, please. Yeah, another question. Can I skip it? Well, I want to say no, don't skip it. There's substantial criminal and civil penalties for not filing or filing false information. Again, the purpose of the act is to try to stop bad actors. So if you don't file, you're kind of putting yourself at risk to be considered whether or not you're, a bad actor. So you might actually get audited here. So many of you might have heard that the Corporate Transparency Act was held to be unconstitutional. However, I need to specify that decision really only applies to National Small Business Administration members or to those who are living in the Northern District of Alabama. So if that's not you, it's still a go. And there's all sorts of Michigan business lawyers that are writing about that decision and saying, please go ahead and report. Next slide, please. Okay, so a few tips here. So we start at that link there in the top left. Once you get on the page, you just click at getting started at the top, BOI filing. That's simple enough. Next slide, please. However, you get to the second page and it's not quite as intuitive. So that's why I made these pictures here so you could see where to click. For most people, you're going to want to file on that second one that's a file online BOIR. The top one is probably more for attorneys and CPAs who will be using the system frequently. Next slide, please. So then you get a pop-up that says you're agreeing to be on a federal government website. Go ahead and just after you agree to that, then this is the scene that you'll see. You'll see this screen and the filing information, reporting company, those blocks. You'll kind of work through each of those blocks till you file. Next slide, please. Okay. So just one more tip. When you get to the company applicant screen, if you're one of those existing businesses that you've been around for a while and you're doing your initial filing, you're going to check this box at the top. And what's not obvious is that after you check that box, you just need to push next and go to the next screen, because you don't need to file for a company applicant unless you're a newly formed business. Next, please. Yeah, and if you have a question, look at those need help drop downs. Actually, could you back up one slide? Yeah, so you can see that actually it's in that circle, need help, or right under company applicant, need help. Those are actually really helpful. And that's sort of how I learned to navigate the site. Next slide, please. Yeah, so and feel free to contact me, talk more details or talk through whether or not you need to report. I can get you started in the right direction. But I think, yeah, just feel free to contact me. And next slide, please. Yeah, and here's some links. We have a great article that goes over some of these tips, but this one does a better job of visually putting them out there. It's pretty simple, fast and simple, and the information isn't that onerous. So I encourage you to keep to make sure you do this on time if it applies to you. And thanks for your time.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris, so much for talking about the Corporate Transparency Act. If you have questions, Chris gave you some good places to look for questions. You can also throw them in the Q&A for now, and we'll see if we can keep an eye on that for any questions for Chris. All right, next up we have installing new colonies from Dan.
Yeah, thanks. So this is the time of year, or soon will be, when new bees are showing up, whether this is going to be your first spring with bees, or you're getting more or replacing those that didn't make it. So typically mid to late April, we start seeing packages come into the state from out-of-state producers that bring them in. Nukes available, whether they're locally produced nukes, anywhere from kind of the last of April in through May, depending on the queen is local or coming in. So what we've done is for both those topics, installing a package, which is going to be kind of 3 pounds and a queen and a can of syrup, or a nuke, which is a full, all the parts of a colony, all stages of brood, a laying queen established on comb. Whichever direction you've decided to go for your new bee install, we've got a video for each of those on our YouTube channel, the Michigan State University Beekeeping. The links to those specific videos are in the links resource that Anna posted earlier, and that again will be posted later. But would really encourage you to watch those videos. Probably watch them a couple times, especially if you're new to it. Think through before the day your bees show up and make sure you've got all the things you need. So you're prepared to do this. You may be, you probably don't have control the day they're showing up. So you may be doing this in kind of marginal conditions. So having kind of your wits about you, knowing how you're going to go through the process and making sure you have everything on hand before you get started kind of can minimize the stress on you as a new beekeeper, and also your new bees that you're going to be installed. So watch those videos. We wanted to keep it brief there, but we can certainly answer questions specific to nuke and package installs in the Q&A here.
Dan, before we go forward, do you want to just say what the difference between a nuke and a package is?
Sure. Yeah. So a package, I kind of think of a package as like an infant. It's typically 3 pounds. It's a set volume of bees, or I guess a set weight of bees. 3 pounds is the most common. You can get a 2-pound package, but 3 pounds is about 10,000 bees. That'll come with a queen, a mated queen. And then typically it's got a can, like a quart of syrup that the bees can sip off of in transit. They're usually in a mesh ventilated box, so they don't overheat when they're transported. So that's a package, again, set weight of bees and a laying queen and some food to sustain. If a package is an infant, I kind of liken a nuke as like a toddler. It's a full, complete unit. They've got resources of their own. Most commonly, you'll see like a 5-frame nuke. So that's typically 3 frames of brood and then 2 frames that have food on them, both pollen and honey, and then space, some room for expansion, because that colony will grow in the spring. So that's a complete beehive. It's just a smaller version of the big mature colonies.
Great. And then Dan's going to continue with feeding.
Yeah, so we kind of labeled this as spring feeding. For me, we're right on that cusp of, and full disclosure, I got back about 45 minutes ago from feeding bees myself, and what I would consider would be winter feeding. I put dry sugar on top. This time of year, it's not that you couldn't get a colony to take syrup. I know beekeepers have been doing it. We've had kind of a strange winter/spring with the warm up. our bees our timing is off by a couple of weeks of where maybe we would expect them to be, but I would point you towards another resource in these links that Anna shared from Zachary Wong, who often joins us on these office hour webinars, all about feeding bees syrup or dry sugar. I guess we're talking about feeding carbohydrates as opposed to protein feeding. And right now, beekeepers can lose a lot of colonies right now, and the way colonies are lost in March, even into April, is generally through starvation. If they've made it this far through the winter, they're probably in pretty good health. If we lose colonies to Varroa mite damage and the associated viruses or general illness, sickness, we typically lose those colonies in the winter in kind of November, December, January. Once they've gotten past that point, once we get into February, March, starvation is their primary threat, particularly in a year like this when we have 70-degree days in February. In the last, where I'm at in central Michigan, Ingham County, we had maple pollen coming in on February 26th, 7th, 8th. 2 weeks ago on March 11th, we had a couple 73-degree days. So the bees are getting these mixed signals from the environment of spring is here, food coming in, let's rear the brood. And then the last 10 days, aside from today, had virtually no flying weather as it returned to more normal conditions around central Michigan. So what we're wanting to prevent this time of year is starvation. The two primary ways to do that are, you're putting dry sugar on as opposed to liquid sugar in the syrup form. So you can do what's called a sugar board or fondant or candy, or mountain camping. Mountain camping involves just putting basically a sheet of newspaper or paper over the top bars of the hive and then pouring dry sugar onto it. The bees will chew through the newspaper, they chew the sugar out. That's my preferred method of the two, but nothing at all wrong. I know lots of beekeepers put fondant or candy boards on. There's lots of good, say, recipes, demonstrations on how to mix up this fondant. And you can pour it in specialty boards, let it harden, and then put it on top of your hives. And do you want to have a little bit of a mess in your kitchen and then less mess in the bee yard with the fondant candy boards? Or do you want to, mountain camping is kind of no mess at home, but you're going to be pouring the sugar on top. Anna's got really good pictures to kind of show you what's happening. And as you see the bees eat away at that sugar, after a couple of weeks, the sugar kind of functionally becomes like fondant because it does absorb some moisture from within the colony. So it's not as messy after the initial pouring it on the newspaper. It does kind of become solid and chunky, and then the bees just eat away at it as needed. So that's called mountain camping, or just, like dry sugar feeding on top. The one thing I didn't mention is you want to, like a spacer rim or something around the top. You can see that in a couple of the photos that, typically a entrance rim a top rim is maybe 1.5 inches or something like that deep. So you can get quite a bit of sugar on there for the full, length and width of the colony with 1.5 inches. I probably get something in the vicinity of 10 pounds or so on, and that's going to sustain them for a couple weeks. So now Megan's going to talk about what to do with those that didn't survive and how to deal with deadouts this time of year.
Yeah, the super, super happy part about if your bees don't make it through the winter. So I believe there is an article associated with this called Dealing with Deadouts. It's on our website. It should be in the link. It's the short or the little bit longer version. So this is one of the talks that I commonly do, and I give about 1.5 hours of this. So if you have more questions, we're happy to answer them later, but I'm going to give you the very, very high speed, high priority version of this. I bring everything back to the shop and do everything at home. And there's kind of 3 decisions that I make. So I go out, and if I find a deadout, I just immediately bring it back. I quickly check for American foulbrood. I call the frames and old equipment. and then I clean and make sure everything else is really well stored. So when I'm looking for AFB signs, this is something that is very unlikely that you're going to see it, but if you miss it, it's really important. So this is less than 1 second per frame. So it's just a really quick peek. What you're doing is you have the top bar facing towards you like Randy does here, and then the sun is going to be over your shoulder or a really bright light, and you're looking for something that is, it would be parallel to the ground, kind of like the floor of the cell. So it's parallel to the ground when the hive is in, or when the frame is in its normal position in the hive. And what you're kind of picturing is that the larva melted down and dried. So in this photo, the top bar is to our lower left, or to the left-hand side of the frame. And when American foulbrood kills a larva, it's when the larva is like stretched out along the bottom of the cell, and then it has peptides that completely disintegrate it. So it turns almost to a liquid, and then it dries to black. And the reason I'm describing this grossness is because it kind of helps you visualize what it is. So European foulbrood can also cause a very similar looking scale, but it doesn't disintegrate the bee into a liquid. So it's actually like a little chunky thing you can take out. Whereas this one is going to be like actually stuck. So if you tried to remove this scale that we see pictured here, like with the tweezers, you'd pull apart the whole cocoon and the comb as well. So this is something we're looking for very quick. The reason is because these scales can have the spores in them that live for literally 100 years. And each one of these scales has potentially millions of spores, and it only takes less than 10 to infect a larva. So if I found this frame and I put it in a hive, that's where you'd want to be concerned about. This is a similar, you can see the scales on really, really old equipment, but another tool we have available to us is a blacklight. And we do have this in the diagnostics, some like rules and tips about using blacklights for scale. But basically you just get one for very cheap, and it will show that the scales will fluoresce. And so these are this is the same slide, it kind of shifted over, but you can see that the scales fluoresce. There are some other things like fungal sores that will fluoresce, but you can see again that shape where they're laying flat across the bottom of the frame or the cells. And obviously, if you find anything with the American foulbrood or that you suspect of American foulbrood, then I would just bird them. If they have wax frames, if they are plastic frames, then you would want to double bag them in a contractor bag and take them to a place for incineration. It is very unlikely that you will find them because usually if you have a colony that has American foulbrood, it would be, you would see signs of it before going into winter. So a lot of these colonies that are like big and healthy in the summer, and then you get them all ready for winter, wouldn't be so good. The colonies that I'm really concerned about, or that we would expect to see it, is if you know, life got in the way of life and you just couldn't keep up with your bees and you just put stuff away in the winter and you don't know what condition they were in. And some weaker colonies got through, or you weren't good at inspecting and you just put everything into winter, you know, including your weak and sick ones. This would be the ones that I would be concerned about. And then for the culling part, so that's the quick check for American foulbroods, but even if you don't see anything bad, it's still useful to get rid of 10 to 20% of your frames. That's the number we tell people. We don't have awesome data for it. So these are the two things I could find that gave us data. One is when the Bee Informed Partnership did their management surveys, they found that if you got rid of all of your frames, you didn't do as well. And if you got rid of none of your frames, you didn't do as well, or between 50%. So there's kind of some data there's a correlation between 0 and 50. But if we look at how bees are naturally in nature, honeybee colonies on average live 5 to 6 years in the wild, which makes sense if we think about what happens is that a honeybee colony will live in a tree cavity, it will swarm every year, and in good weather, about 80% of the time, the queen comes back from that mating flight, which means that about 20% of the time, or 1 out of 5 times, that queen doesn't come back from her mating flight because she gets eaten by a bird or whatever. And then this beautiful wax moss actually does have a role in nature where it will eat away all of that comb, and then a new colony will move in. So in the wild, we don't have this system of perpetual comb. So we do recommend getting rid of 10 to 20% of your frames every year. The ones that you actually do get rid of, though, you want to balance the risk. So I think you can flip forward. So I don't get, so the ones that I prioritize are ones that have mouse poop on them, because that's disgusting and we eat out of those hives. Ones that are really, really bad with like broken frames and stuff like that. Ones that have a lot of pollen, which is hard because pollen looks really nice and good, but protein does not get better with time. Plus, pollen is where we have a lot of the pesticides and pathogens build up. The only time that I retain old frames of pollen after new pollen has started to come in is if I'm making a lot of nukes. So if I've got one big colony and I'm going to break it down into like 3 nukes and I know they're not going to be able to collect a lot of pollen, I might retain those frames. But on a dead colony, I'm going to get rid of the pollen frames. And then, but things that I don't worry about, this blue mold that you often see, that's just a sign of the moisture that comes in after the honeybee colony is dead. This is non-pathogenic to bees. You could put this frame in a strong colony and it would be totally fine. I wouldn't give it to your like one new package. Rusty Burlew has a lovely little thing on this called Ick. There's mold in my hive. It's on Honeybee Sweet. And again, this is something that is not a gift to a hive, but it's not going to be pathogenic. However, this might be one that you would want to melt down, partially because of that blue mold, but also for me more because it has pollen on the sides. And then also when you see all that liquid, that's something, you know, capped honey is lovely, but open liquid in a dead colony could be something that is fermenting or growing yeasts or something like that. This is fine. And I also have in my talker, when I go through it, I say, you know, here are the things, like this looks fantastic. This actually looks better than most of my equipment. But there's definitely frames that I would keep if I'm desperate and if it's my only drawn comb, or I'd get rid of in August. And a couple more, like this one would be totally fine. Even though it has pollen, it looks much better. And then this one I would probably get rid of because, well, first off, it's just full of old bee bread. Even though you're like, oh man, look at that, there's so much food on it. It is hard that this is generally where most of the pesticides are going to be in your colony. And so if you have to get rid of your 20%, I would get rid of your 20, I would pull your pollen frames. And then, oh, the other thing that I add to the list is any frames that came in from another operation. So if you purchase a nuke and next year I would pull those frames out that came from another operation. All right. I said I'd probably toss this in the fall, use in the spring. And again, there's not a right answer of like, oh, if I save this one frame, it's going to be terrible. Or if I do 30%, it's going to be great. And if I do 10%, it's going to be bad. But it is good to practice some sort of comb rotation and just err on the side of keeping the ones that have not had brood in them, that don't have protein in them. So that's the brood silk and the pollen, and keeping the ones that are nicer and newer. All right. And then there is not a completely right answer. So I have worked with beekeepers that want to replace everything, and a lot of beekeepers just dump a new package right in. We have that practice is done often enough to know that that's not, you know, maybe the bees are going to be exposed to things, but there are plenty of healthy colonies that emerge from being dumped onto old equipment. You just want to balance whether or not it's going to be a huge amount of work for them to clean it all up versus the benefit they get from having drawn comb. So there's a huge benefit of having drawn comb, but it's also a lot of work for them to deal with all of this mold. All right, so there's no magic risk. Like we said, you can use 10 to 20% as a guideline, but maybe if you had a bad bacterial disease outbreak, you would want to use a lot more. Or if you did, you know, thought you suspected a spray, you might want to be really diligent about pulling out pests or pollen things. So it isn't something that we can say, take this frame out, put on some bleach and do that. It is really just you managing how much money you have, how much time you have, and how risk averse you are when you put the colonies back in. All right. Oh man. So, and this is the balance. You can flip through this really quick. So this is basically being risk averse, having money, having time. So if you have plastic foundation, you basically have two options. One is you can pop the frame out and toss the foundation away, and you can reuse the woodenware. We have a dead out, we're really concerned about things that the bees are putting their mouths on. They don't put a lot of mouth to mouth stuff on the woodenware, even though they might cover it with level of propolis, like you can see. But the comb is really where all the risk is. So you can hand scrape it off if you have the time. You do just need to recoat the wax foundation. So if you put that back in, the bees won't use it unless you coat it. If you've got beeswax foundation, you can just scrape it all out again by hand, as you see in these photos that Rob has, which again is a lot of effort. Or you can use heat. So then you could just put new foundation, or you can use heat like a solar melter or a heat melter to get those the foundation out and just put in new foundation. So you don't necessarily have to throw the whole frame away, but just focus on getting new foundation into 10 to 20% of your hives. Oh, and those are the priority ones. I was looking at the questions, but I think we'll let Anna go first and I'll answer. I do see some really good questions on there, but we'll answer those at the end.
All right, sounds great. Thank you. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about reversals and space. So this time of year, we're thinking about, entering as we continue into spring, the queen's going to be laying, she's going to need space, which means empty comb for laying those eggs. And then the bees are also going to need space, which is empty comb, to store incoming resources like nectar and pollen. So we did a webinar a couple of years ago on preparing for swarm season for established colonies, so colonies that had made it through the winter. And we go through a lot of your different options in more detail in that webinar. So check out that recording if you have questions. We'll also answer questions tonight. But we'll give you a few things to think about now. One is that you can consider early supering. So that means putting boxes on your hives really early in the spring, and that can buy you some time before you split your colonies. So you can add your supers on as incoming nectar is coming into the hive, even before it's consistently warm. So in the lower peninsula, that might be on a nice day in April. And what you're doing is you're making room above the brood nest, right? So you add boxes early with, you can do that without disturbing the bees. You don't even have to do an inspection or pull frames out. But if you have a hive that's there, you're adding a couple of supers on top, you've made space for the incoming nectar and avoided crowding your queen. So this is one way to kind of buy some time so that the bees aren't crowding and aren't trying to swarm sooner than they need to. And a question we get a lot this time of year is if we should do a reversal to give the bees some more space above the brood nest. And that's an option if you have a situation where the colony and the cluster and the brood nest are kind of all in one box. So like if they're all in the top box and it's maybe a smaller cluster and that brood nest is all in that top box, sure, then you can do a reversal, and so you can move the bottom box to the top and that will give the bees some empty comb or some space above the brood nest. What we often see, however, though, are these situations where the brood nest is split between the boxes. And this is a situation where we really don't want to do a reversal, because if we reverse the boxes, then we're going to split up that brood nest. And the bees need to be able to keep the brood nest warm, especially in the spring when we can have some cooler temperatures, especially overnight. It can be really problematic to split that brood nest because some of the brood can get chilled and it can stress the colony. All right, and then we also just want to talk a little bit about Varroa mites, and I can see we have some questions in the Q&A that we can get to about Varroa mites, but I'll start by just sharing a few resources. One are the series that Megan did on Why Did My Bees Die? Understanding Varroa Risk and Making a Plan for the Varroa Mite. And so we have webinars and videos and articles on those topics. And then the Honeybee Health Coalition has its Tools for Varroa Management Guide that goes through all the different treatment options. But right now, this time of year, we're thinking about what our colonies look like coming through winter. Was our Varroa mite management last year adequate? And starting to think through what are our options for this beekeeping season, especially as we get started here. All right, so I'm just sharing again, this is where we compiled all the links to tonight's webinar. They're all on this page. And this is also where we'll post the webinar recording. All right, and with that, we're going to get into questions.
All right, Anna, so you know the first one. Do you have a recommendation for spring Varroa treatment?
Yeah, so I think there's going to be, I'm sorry, let me get
Oh,
my,
sorry, I didn't realize you're still navigating slides. So.
I didn't know I was either. Okay, we're good now. So that's going to be something that's really going to depend a lot on the situation, right? So in the spring, we are kind of limited because we can have some smaller, so I guess I'll back up. When we think about Varroa options, we're thinking about how big is the colony? What are the temperature conditions? Do we have honey supers on, or will we have them on soon? And then those are, I guess, some of the main ones. So sometimes, I guess normally what I end up doing is waiting until after splits to do a Varroa mite treatment. That's kind of how it's normally worked out best for me and my operation. But then after I split them, I want to keep a close eye on them to make sure that their populations are strong enough after splitting before I do something like a formic acid treatment. So formic acid is a really nice treatment because we can use it when honey supers are on, when there's sealed brood in the hive. But we need to be careful that we are doing it only when colonies are strong enough to handle it. So not on an itty bitty brand new nucleus colony. And we also need to make sure that the temperatures are in the right window. For smaller colonies in the spring, I've also tried using HopGuard as an option because you can use that with honey supers on as well. Yeah, Dan and Megan, what do you, yeah.
That's what I was just going to do. I was going to ask Dan, what are you doing at MSU for early spring treatment for Varroa?
Yeah, so generally early spring is not, I'm not looking at probably doing anything in the next month or so. As Anna mentioned there, our colony, like it is still March, despite some of this weather. I keep reminding myself, like it's early, even though, we do try to keep bees by what's going on in the calendar, not necessarily by, we keep, sorry, we keep bees on what we're seeing in the hive, not necessarily the calendar. Been in Michigan long enough to know that we've got more snow coming. We have these kind of, periods where it's favorable and unfavorable. So right now I'm not, really looking at a mite treatment in the next month or so. Probably as we get closer to May, but it's not at the top list of my concerns because I know we're going to split most colonies. The fact that a colony came through and overwintered well means we probably did okay on our mite management last year, so we wouldn't expect to have huge mite numbers right now. And given that I'm probably going to be looking at splitting colonies in about a month, give or take a week, we will probably look at assessing a chemical mite treatment into May and beyond once we see, haven't really had a chance to dig in the brood nest yet and see where things are at or do any mite samples. That's going to inform our decisions on how urgently we want to treat for mites. But right now in the next month or so, it's not a big concern or something that I'm really looking at.
And I would say the same, that my first management strategy for me for Varroa is the way that I do my splits. So I let a lot of bees raise their own queen, and then I also use a lot of queen cells. So I count on an early break in the brood cycle. Dan and I were talking that we do think that this year could be particularly bad for Varroa just because of how mild the winter was and how early things started to brood up. One thing to keep in mind, we're all talking to you with having had really good success the last few years. So we know that we do have a really good Varroa management strategy. I do credit the brood breaks as being a really important part of that. And then as Anna mentioned, the summer formic. So we really don't start using the chemical treatments until later in the season. And all of our bees are stationary. So they do get a really long winter brood break. if you are concerned and wanted to do something else, or whatever you did last year is not sufficient, this would also be one of the times you could use Apivar. So people can use the Apivar as an early treatment in there as well. And then for when you get packages and nukes, I don't know if Anna, do you want to talk about that? About like for people getting packages, what they could do, and people getting nukes, what they could do?
Yeah, so if you're getting a package, you have a few options. So the oxalic acid label, or apabioxyl is the product name, has one option where you can apply oxalic acid solution to the package while the bees are still in that package box. We did try that when I was in Minnesota a few years ago, and you're supposed to wait a certain amount of time before you hive the package, and we generally just kind of like to get the bees in the hive sooner rather than later. So another option, if after you hive the package, you can wait a few days. After the queen started laying, you'll be in if you only wait a few days, there won't be any sealed brood in the hive yet. So you can do an oxalic acid solution method application to the bees then. And that's a really nice opportunity, because at that point, since there's no sealed brood, all of the varroa mites that are in that new colony are going to be exposed on the adult bees, and you can do that oxalic acid treatment to try to knock down any of the mites before there's any sealed brood in the hive. So that's one option. For nucleus colonies, you can do hop guard on colonies that are that small, and that would probably be one of the things I would consider, especially because you're thinking about how they have sealed brood in the hive. But there'd be other options too. I guess you could also consider like Apivar, which is amatraz, but we do know there's more and more resistance to that treatment.
And then we'll just keep the Varroa party going. So someone asks, with the spring buildup, so this is for overwintered hives, would it make sense, or is it counterintuitive to administer an early oxalic acid treatment in early spring in the UP? Hey, UP friends, see you this Saturday. So the current label for oxalic acid does say that it should be used when there's not brood in the hive. And part of the reason for that is because it is not effective on anything under the capped brood. So if you have done, like we do a oxalic acid treatment in the winter or the late fall. So if you've done that, there shouldn't be a lot of mites on your loose bees. So it wouldn't be necessary to do it in the spring. I don't know if Anna, you want to add anything to overwintered hives? All right, and then someone asks about effective organic treatments. So do you want to do that, or do you want me to do that one?
Why don't you start with what does organic mean, Megan?
Okay, so Anna's saying that because she knows I love to be technically correct on all terms. So organic is the only term that is regulated where it actually has a definition. So we do have a list of pesticides that are considered organic, and this says organic in quotes. So there are two that are officially listed as organic, and that's formic acid and oxalic acid. So if you are following organic management practices, you can use those two. There are further options that are naturally derived. So hop guard would be one of those, but in order to be organic, you have to have like all of the ingredients be organic, and they're not like, they don't have the official listing. And then the ones that are thymol based, like based off of the oils of the thyme plant, would be Apalife Var and Apagard. So they're naturally derived, but they would not be considered under the definition of organic. But you have the little quote thing, so they could be in the like organic, but not like organic, capital O. Oh, and there's another question about using the thymol treatments. Okay, there was one more about Varroa, I think. Oh, someone actually, this is really nice. So it's a comment, but I like it. It says, this is the first time being diligent about fall mite treatments, and all three hives look good so far. And I've worked with beekeepers that said that everything changes when they start to take Varroa seriously or critically, but I like diligently as well. So Dan, how about this next one, which I'm curious to hear what you have to say. What should we do if we find a lot of queen cells in the hive at this time of year? And you could answer if they're in Michigan and if they're not in Michigan.
Yeah, so I'm gonna assume you are in Michigan. I have not been digging in my colonies enough to know if there are queen cells. I hope not. It is still March. I think the fork in the road of you have queen cells in your colony now or soon is it a good, big, strong, booming colony, and are these swarm cells reproduction cells? Or is this a weak colony and you have supersedure shells? Your queen has started to fire, she's tried to hit the gas pedal here as the spring pollen started to come in, and she's just not up to it. Maybe she's just hit the end of the line. She doesn't have enough semen left, whatever it is. They're looking at superseding her. So if you can make that determination, that's really gonna be your answer. Either way, it's, if you have swarm cells in your colony now, you're looking at your queen trying to do a mating flight in, somewhere in the next 10 days range. It is still early April in Michigan, so that's it's just largely weather dependent. And also drone maturity dependent, whether, the probability of that being successful. Myself, I would probably, given it's still March, if I was seeing swarm cells in a healthy colony, I'm probably going to try to deter that swarm. I'm going to cut those cells out. I'm going to, maybe do a reversal, probably put an extra, try to give them more space. So putting an extra box on or things, it feels a little early to do that to me, but it's been a strange year and I haven't been digging in colonies to know if they have swarm cells or not. I hope not. If it is more the problem hive supersedure, I'm probably gonna, at this point, again, with the same timing of drone availability and a queen trying to go out and mate on an early April day, probably being a low success rate. I'm probably going to kind of look at that colony as a goner and think about newspaper combining it onto something else. So if there are bees and resources left, kind of integrating that into another colony. So that'd probably be my approach. But again, I don't know if I have queen cells in my colonies right now, and I kind of don't want to know. But I don't think many of them are going to have them. There's always the oddball one that does something strange. But yeah, if it's healthy, I'd be looking at more space. If it's not healthy or not, if it's supersedure, then I would probably be considering that one to be combined with something that could use more space.
And I just want to add one quick thing, because I know sometimes beekeepers switch up the words, but if it's a queen, so you might just be, I'm hoping that you're just saying queen cups, right? So queen cups are the beginning of queen cells, they're the empty cups, and there's no egg or larva or pupa in them. So it would be kind of, I would expect to start seeing lots of queen cups in the hives this time of year. The bees will really make a lot of them. And then a queen cell is when we actually have a developing bee in that cup or that cell.
I was thinking the exact same thing. And then if it is a swarm cell, there would be two other things that you could look for. And we're going to talk about this next month, probably a lot, but it would be that they would start backfilling the brood nest with nectar. Like that's one of the really obvious signs of swarming. And then also you would have frames of brood that are like wall to wall brood. Like that's when those colonies are really ready to swarm. And so that's probably not likely in Michigan right now. But like as Dan said, bees can do whatever they want. You can have them do weird things. Here's another one for you, Dan, on mountain camp to feed. So if to use mountain camp to feed, the hive needs to be a certain size to generate enough moisture, correct?
I guess I haven't had that issue. If I did have a small colony that I was really trying to baby through and make it easy on, I would probably look at finding a frame of honey from a stronger colony to give it and put it right adjacent to. I'm not going to put it in the middle of where those bees are, but I'm going to put it on one side or the other. So yeah, I have put, newspaper sugar mountain camp style on, small colonies, and they do get up and consume it. Slower than the other ones, obviously, but that's kind of less mouths, and their needs are much smaller too, as far as what's going to sustain them for a couple weeks until warmer and you have other feeding options on the table. So that would be, I've done it to small colonies, and it has kind of kept them going. But you could also look at putting a frame of honey adjacent to right next to the bees from a stronger colony.
And I've also seen it go the other way where the colony is so big that they just remove the sugar. So I've had a beekeeper like who was doing mountain camp, but they didn't have to because the colony had plenty of stored honey, and they were just taking the sugar and dumping it in the yard. So the beekeeper was emotionally feeling better that they were helping the bees, but they were just sugaring their yard with a lot of labor. So if it is really big, they might just remove it as well. All right, so there is a question about whether or not new beekeepers that are getting packages with new equipment should try some of the pre-drawn out comb, the Better comb, which I know is sold at Better Bee. I don't know if anybody else has the pre-drawn comb, with installation to help hive the queen or get a jump in lane while the comb is being drawn out, especially in the north. So I've never used that comb in particular. However, the context, I do think that's the best context for it to be used. I used to teach at the Samba Bee Club, and there was one year where the students, so they have a bunch of students who all get packages that come in, and they kind of have a group teaching yard. And there was one year that basically all the bees died because it was all on brand new equipment. And the packages came in, and then it got really, really cold, and the bees couldn't cluster and they couldn't store food. So if you are getting a package, especially if you're getting one of those early ones where you're getting it in like March or beginning of April, and we're likely to get cold weather, it could be useful. But it's very expensive and it's very, very fragile, so I would not get a lot of it. I don't know if Anna or Dan, have you used it or have any
I
experience?
have not used it, but Sam, yeah, a couple frames to get one of those, say fragile new units, just help them get their feet under them. I would be open to it, but I've not done it myself.
All right. So now we've got some deadouts. So what should I do with the honey left in the deadout? I have tried to come up, so I only have one solution, and it is putting it on another hive. It is really hard to store honey in frames. And at this time of year, it's probably crystallized. Plus, if you have been feeding, it probably has sugar water in it. And so it's just not something you want to extract for human consumption. I don't extract honey from brood frames. At MSU and in my own operation, I try really hard to that we have like deeps are for bees, mediums are for humans. So we can keep mediums very, very clean. So everything going for human consumption is treated, human food level stuff. And then bees are when, there's a chance that they might need a medication or they might need sugar water or something like that. So I never extract from brood frames. It's just really hard to store them because everybody loves the mice and small hive beetles. If you do have a freezer, you can store them in, if you have the freezer space to handle the boxes, you can do that. Otherwise, the safest place for them is on another hive. So hopefully not all of your bees died. And you can put them on some bees. All right, I'm gonna do, okay. Anna, how do you suggest determining where the brood nest is located? Is it okay to fully open the hive on a warm day? Because if someone would like to do a reversal if merited.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, some of it you might be able to tell just by splitting the boxes, right? So if you split the boxes pretty quickly and all the bees are in the same box, that might be enough information. Sometimes you can also tell where there's brood just by looking down in between the frames and seeing where there's brood. We're not doing like full inspections at this time of year or digging in our hives. But when it does get warm, if it's really warm in the 50s, 60s, you could pull a frame or two out, check and see if there's brood in both those boxes.
Excellent. You guys have really good questions. I'm excited.
I know.
These. So someone asked about what do you do when you're cleaning up frames with bee poop from eczema or dysentery on them? Is there a way to clean them, including acetic acid? So that's a really good question. I do have a very low tolerance for poop regarding anything for food service, which I feel like is an appropriate level to have. There are no human diseases that you can get from bee pathogens by eating them, thankfully. So it's not going to be a danger to humans to have them in there, but your bees are going to be cleaning them out with your mouths, or with their mouths. A lot of what I do is just physical scraping. So if there is a lot of bee poop on the frames, that was on the list that I went through at high speed of ones that I prioritize. So if the bee poop is in the combs, I do actually melt down those combs. There is a comment in here that it is from Nosema. Nosema apis, the old version of Nosema, can absolutely cause dysentery. We see much less of it than we do now. A lot of the times when you see dysentery in your hive on a deadout, it's because the cluster is so small that they can't get out to take a poop because they're all around this little tiny brood nest. And then the reason the cluster is so small is because all of their sisters died from Varroa associated viruses. So the other situation where we still see a lot of dysentery is when you've got like unripened honey. So you can have like yeast, or the honey can kind of ferment, or the food can be bad in there. So they didn't get totally capped before they went into winter. So I don't have recommendations of using acetic acids. We do have a grant of what disinfectants can be used to clean things on frames. We don't have good data on using like bleach or acetic acid or what is necessary to kill everything on the frame. And part of the problem with that is because wood is so porous and inconsistent. So it's really hard to come up with like actual guidelines. You can use heat and time, and time and temperature is always the way that you can sterilize things if you have access to those facilities. But I would highlight the ones that are covered with poop for culling. And then, okay, Anna, if I only have one deep as a brood box and mediums above, can I do a reversal and put the medium box on the bottom and the deep above?
Sure, as long as they're all brood boxes and they're all and you're not splitting up the brood nest, you can put those boxes in whatever order you want.
And I strongly say, like, you should have deeps for your brood boxes and mediums for your honey supers. And then if you actually look through my operation, my brood nests are like deep, medium, deep, medium, deep, deep. So they do get mixed in. However, once they are mixed into the brood nest, they're just brood frames forever, basically. So someone says, can I use a brood box, a medium 8 frame that's unoccupied and broodless in the spring for a honey super during a flow later in the spring? I might have the writer. Do you guys understand that one?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
I'm gonna take it.
So I think the question is, can you use a box that was previously a brood box as a honey super?
Okay, yeah.
And so I like to keep them super separate. And the nice thing about just using honey supers for honey is that you can use those combs they have a much longer lifespan, right? Like if we're talking about the brood nest, there's pollen that gets stored in there. There's the pupal cocoons and everything, and that can be attracted to pests. So I have a preference for keeping those separate and just using new foundation or previously honey boxes for honey supers, and then using the brood comb as brood comb and culling it out or rotating it out over time. Megan or Dan, any?
That's not my preference as well. They try to keep them separate as much as possible, and super frames can become brood frames, but not vice versa. Generally is how we try to run things.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we're still kind of on looking at old frames. So someone had one hive absconded last fall, which is likely Varroa. That's very classic for Varroa-associated viruses, and left me with a good number of frames of honey. I only have a few hives. Can or should I give those frames to my other hives? So I would, because it's the safest place to store them. So for me, this time of year, well, in full disclosure, this time of year, I'm 8 hours away from where my hives are, and hopefully I fed them well enough to get through the winter, and I'll be down there starting to do things with them in about a week or so. And the first thing that I'm going to do is stack things on them, because once we start doing splits, which where I am in Jackson County is usually around the end of April, first week of May, it's nice to have all that equipment in the yard. So if your colony is really, or if your hive is really tall with, honey from different deadouts, and they're kind of in this high volume at this time of year, it's not the end of the world, because, in just a few weeks, I swear it will get warmer and you'll be able to kind of reorganize everything. So kind of letting the bees protect it and having it on a tall hive is perfectly fine. Again, your other option is really freezing it, but it's really hard to keep mice and other pests away from it. I don't know if you guys have any other options for honey frames besides just putting it on hives. All right. How about, oh, I see Anna is responding to the Bee City question. So I did want to just bring out that there is an official definition. So I was going to highlight that one. So someone says that they work in the city of Novi who express an interest in becoming a bee-friendly city. And they have some like recommendations of things that they want to do. But we are working on more specific recommendations that things can do, but there is a program called Bee City USA. And so there is actually, like, if you want to be a bee-friendly city, that is a thing you can do. I don't know if you want to actually say things for that as well. Perfect. All right, so when you're adding supers for nectar, would you suggest a queen excluder so she stays down below? Dan, do you want to do that one first, and then we'll go through all of our opinions on queen excluders?
Sure. Yeah, and it's like a lot of bee topics. Everybody's right and everybody's wrong. Depends who you ask. There's pros and cons to it. So you certainly can. I tend to be a fan of queen excluders. Like part of it is keeping ensuring that brood combs stay separate from, so my honey combs don't become brood combs because the queen wants to go in them. Gives me kind of a mechanical certainty that that's not going to happen. But there are downsides. It is when you're trying to add space to relieve congestion in the brood nest, and then you put a barrier that prevents some of that wanting to add space is so the queen has places to lay and is not feeling crowded and gets swarming. But if you're putting more space on and then restricting the queen from getting to it, she's not going to go up there and lay. You're counting on the bees to put nectar up there. So I'm a fan of them. It also helps for when we're storing comb in the winter. The fact that it hasn't had brood raised in it makes it a lot less attractive to wax moth and mice and things like that. So, but others have other opinions. Megan, Anna can share their thoughts.
He's laughing because he knows I have other opinions about queen excluders. And I did hear someone said the joke that, like, how you have like a school of fish and a murder of crows, and what you call a group of beekeepers, it's an argument of beekeepers, which I very much like. So I agree with 100% of everything that Dan says. It is way nicer to have your stuff clean. My bees just don't like going through queen excluders. And so a lot of times when I put them on, they would rather backfill the bird nest than go up through them. So there are a lot of times that I'll get out there and then in frustration, I'll pull them off. The one point I do want to make, though, is if you only have foundation and you don't have drawn comb, then the bees will not go up through the queen excluder. So we can have all of our preferences that we want, as long as we're talking about supers that have at least some drawn comb in them, like a couple frames even is the difference. But if you're starting out your first year or whatever, and you have brand new foundation, then the bees will not go through a queen excluder. Usually, I mean, obviously they'll do whatever they want, but like they generally don't go through a queen excluder to draw out foundation.
Just one other consideration too with the supering early in the spring is it makes sense if you're not planning on needing to feed syrup in the spring, right? So if you're trying to early super for incoming nectar, but your colonies are pretty low on food and you anticipate needing to feed syrup, then that's going to mean that you'll have to take the supers off before feeding syrup.
All right, Anna, you can keep going. When would you recommend that the first time that you would do a test, or like, so let's say an alcohol wash or monitoring for Varroa this year?
We've normally tried to do them in May, so that would be like the first time. But if you're doing early season management in late April, you could consider it that too. But basically the time of year when it's warm enough that you're doing a full inspection and taking frames out and checking the brood nests and everything.
Mhm. All right, and then for all of us, I guess, what's the earliest you would put honey supers on? So Dan, do you want to start?
Sure. Probably mid to late April, something like that. A few weeks from now, I would say.
That's the same for me. Like, I always feel that there's a warm up. So again, I'm in Jackson County, South Central. I always feel like there's a warm up mid-April, and that's when nectar starts to come in. So not just the pollen that we've already seen. And then I want to have honey supers on before that. But in between that and like regular honey collection, I will be doing splits and stuff, but I like to have the equipment out there and on the hives. Anna, did you want to add to that? All right. The next question is, do you ever use the Demarest method in the spring? So I do, and I love it. And since I went Demarest, I haven't gone back. So as we mentioned, like this time of year, I do put supers on, but then when I do my splits, it's actually a modified Demarest, and I do have articles written about that. But the basis of that is you actually move, you keep the queen excluded down to the bottom, and you make a split within the hive where you move the brood up top, and you've got space in between. And if you here, I'll put it so that it goes live, but the way that you spell it is Demaree for those of you who want to Google it. But I learned about it, I don't know when I learned about it. I've been using a version of that for like the last 4 or 5 years, and I have been successful in preventing swarming in all of my hives since that time. So for me, it works really well. When I teach the way I do swarm control, though, I call it a perfectly fine method of doing swarm control. So it's not necessarily like better. It works really well for my system because I work full time and keep a bunch of hives on the side. So it's a way that you can do a lot of the rearrangement on a nice day, and then you can kind of do splits and come back on other days. So it's a method that I'm really familiar with if you want to do follow-up questions, but I do like it for Michigan in particular because you basically split the hive and keep the brood in the same hive. So it allows you to kind of just get a little more time before you have to like actually make your really hard splits. I don't know if Anna or Dan, you have any comments or don't love the Demarest. Like I love the Demarest.
No, last year was my first experience with it, so don't have a depth of experience to share from.
But I don't feel strongly that it's better than anything else. It's just one that like literally works with what I want to do with my bees in the spring and what my schedule is like in the spring. So that's what I feel like the best method of splitting is the one that gets you where you want to be. So we have 2 questions that are on swarm traps. So can you use old brood comb and a swarm trap? And then a follow-up, Dan, if you want to hit this one, what week would you put out swarm traps in Southeast Michigan?
Yeah, I old brood comb, sure. Provided it's not diseased or anything like that. But it is going to be something that gets the bees' attention. Putting out swarm traps, mid-April might be a little early, but I suppose better a little early than a little late. I tend to think, swarm season where I'm at in Ingham County is usually from about the last week of April through late May, early June sometimes. Say putting them out mid-April, especially with things kind of trending early this year, wouldn't be inappropriate.
All right, so there is a question, Anna. It's actually a follow-up to the absconding one. And I'm going to be really gentle with this, but I think it is really useful to talk about. So I made the kind of glib comment that if it's absconding, or not glib, but like quick comment that if it's absconding, it is likely Varroa. And the beekeeper followed up and said, I'm not sure why they absconded, but it was a mean hive, so good riddance, which we have all been there. And actually, I keep 10 hives at my house, and I only lost one this winter, and it was the mean one. And I like feel exactly the same way. That said, I had done 3 oxalic acid treatments each a week apart, so I doubt it was Varroa. Anna, do you want to talk about like the use of just 3 oxalic acid treatments as a Varroa management strategy?
Sure. Yeah. So what we've found in our beekeeping experience here in Michigan, and from talking to a lot of beekeepers in Michigan who are consistently keeping their bees alive year after year, is that they're managing Varroa mites throughout the beekeeping season. And so it can be things like Megan mentioned earlier, like brood breaks in the spring that can help keep our mite levels low. But we're normally like it helps a lot if you're monitoring. So doing alcohol wash tests monthly, so you kind of have an understanding of the Varroa mite populations, and it like making sure that you're not seeing any spikes. But we're also trying to manage our mites throughout the season, so we're not letting those Varroa mite levels get high, and we're not letting those associated viruses also spike. So normally that means that we're doing different treatments. Oxalic acid is really tricky because it's only killing the mites on the adult bees, and a lot of the mites can be reproducing in the sealed brood. I know Megan mentioned earlier, but even the label for oxalic acid really recommends it as a treatment that's best when there's not sealed brood in the hive. And I know that sometimes beekeepers try to do it every week to try to catch mites as they're coming out of the brood. But really, we find it to be an effective treatment, especially like in the winter. So after there's no longer much sealed brood in the colony, we'll do an oxalic acid solution method in November, December to try to clean up any mites that are still on those adult bees. But normally in the summer, we're going to look for other treatments. Again, formic acid is one that can be used when honey supers are on and when we have sealed brood in the hive. So that one is one that we'll consider as long as colonies are strong enough and we have the right temperature window. And then like Megan mentioned, later in the season, maybe we might consider a time olive treatment after we pull the honey supers. But at 3 times of oxalic, that would not be enough for me to be confident that you sufficiently managed Varroa mites and that wasn't the cause of the bees absconding.
Yeah, and one of the things when, Anna and I have been teaching about Varroa for many years now, and one of the things we're careful to talk about is the difference between a treatment and like a season-long management strategy. So unfortunately, it's a really garbagey time to keep bees in that like doing a treatment is not sufficient. All right, Dan, so speaking of pests, do you do anything for small hive beetle in the springtime?
I don't. Saying that I don't do anything for small hive beetle throughout the year. I just don't find them to be a huge problem. I have worked in areas where they are problematic, particularly like in the southeast, down in Florida and Georgia. And best practice recommended there. What I've found where beekeepers have gotten into real issues is small colonies, kind of weak colonies, and then feeding protein, feeding patties. And one way it's more of a preventative, but is if you do have an issue, you see more hive beetles around than you'd like, and you are someone that feeds supplemental protein, is not feeding more than what the bees will consume in sort of a week. Better to feed them a quarter of a patty or a third of a patty, over, 3-4 times over a month than give them a pound patty that's going to take them a month to eat, because it's just going to become, writhing with beetle larvae if you do have beetles and you do have small colonies. So preventative, I don't have a lot of. I know there are traps out there, oil traps and things you can put in colonies. I'm just not that experienced with them because I haven't found them to be a problem in places where I've kept bees.
And I think this is one of the times where it's really important to have like local information. So for us being in Michigan, hive beetles are just, you're not going to lose a colony to hive beetles. But if you were a beekeeper in Florida or Georgia, then you absolutely have to talk to Florida or Georgia people because you could lose a healthy colony to hive beetles. But where we are, there are definitely pests of like unintended comb. All right, Anna, when should I take off my winter insulation?
When it gets warm. So it really doesn't, so it doesn't, so I guess one of the questions we could back up and say, like, does it even matter that you have winter insulation on? We don't really know. At MSU, we don't wrap our hives and we haven't had issues getting our colonies to survive winter, but there's lots of information, lots we still could learn about wintering configurations. If you already have a wrap on your hive, you could take it off now, or you could take it off when it gets a little bit warmer. Definitely before we start seeing those hotter temperatures.
And I have seen some studies that have looked like the downside of taking the insulation off early is that the bees get cold. The upside is that they could get heated from the sun. So it is one of those things where there's not like a specific right answer. Oh, are there Reno issues? I hope your dog makes an appearance.
Definitely there are Reno issues from what I can hear upstairs.
No, it's fine. We just let him out on the deck. He's getting antsy, but he's
All
good.
right. I do want to offer a profound apology for not paying the pet tax where we are talking about our pets but not giving you guys cute pictures because we do have plenty of those. So there's a comment about if we have any comments about using flow hives for spring management. And it says the real flow hives. So I'm guessing that is just the like actual branded flow hive. And the flow hive is a standard Langstroth 8-frame hive. The only thing that's interesting about it is the flow part, which is a honey collection tool. So you would not be dealing with this in springtime at all. You're basically doing everything the same as you are for a regular Langstroth hive. You would be putting those supers on. Like if you had that type of fancy honey collection thing, you absolutely don't want brood going up in there. So I wouldn't be dealing with it until like June or July in most of Michigan, depending where you are. All right, Dan, will a colony make viable queen cells with the absence of drones or drone brood? Or Anna, if you want.
I physiologically certainly they could. I mean, making viable queen cells is a having a big fat healthy colony with lots of young bees and the ability to create that jelly and feed a queen. Usually, especially if we're talking about queen cells and swarm cells, the cues that are triggering the making of queen cells are going to be the same that are triggering the making of drones. So while they are, happening kind of on similar timelines, yeah, sure, I don't see any reason why a colony couldn't make a queen cell and not be raising drones.
All right, and there is a question for references for splitting hives. We do have some on our beekeeping page. We're definitely going to be talking about splits a lot at the next office hours. My guess is that's going to be the bulk of the next office hours. So we've got 2 more questions. So I think we can get out by 8:30. So Anna, do you have a preference or knowledge of administering 1 versus 2 Formic Pro treatments during the summer?
Sure, so there's kind of 2 options on the Formic Pro label. One is 2 strips at the same time. One is 1 strip followed by 1 strip several days later. And I've talked with the company before, NOD, the manufacturer of Formic Pro. They've tried it in both. They get good efficacy with both ways. Personally, I like 2 strips at once because then I'm done with it and I don't have to worry about what the temperature windows are going to be the next time I need to apply that other strip. So, but either way is an option for you as a beekeeper.
And we've used the 2 strips many times for many years, and we don't have queen issues. So we've used them in like literally dozens of hives every year and have not seen the queen issues. And there is some data saying that the 2 at a time does get better penetration through the cappings. So it's a little more effective. All right. And then there is a question, the last one on Varroa, and it is about the Varroxan. So Varroxan is a new pesticide that was just recently approved at the federal level, and hopefully it will get approved at each state level. We did get funding from the company to try it. So they gave us some, it's produced in Uruguay, and they gave us some to test last year and some money to try it out. And it worked. I don't have the data to share for everyone yet. I was actually working on it this weekend, but it did work quite well for us. And the way that that one would be used is, so it's penetrated like cardboard strips. So you put it in the colony all summer long. So it's in there for 60 days. And so when we used it from mid-June to mid-August in our colonies in South Central Michigan. And we compared it to the homemade versions of that, and it worked better than that. And we compared it to Formic, and it worked really well compared to Formic as well. So hopefully that one is like, it went very fast through the federal process. And then hopefully it gets approved at the state level and then is like functionally available very soon. And then I think we should end on this very important question of if we can see right now.
He just went downstairs. I let him out.
Okay.
So-
All right, you
Hold
guys,
on.
Hold on.
we will. I'm embarrassed for us that we don't have better animal pics. We will come with it. And Chris had 4 cats. There he is. Oh, what a handsome boy. I don't believe that he was bad at all.
No, he
I think
wasn't
he
bad.
was
He just needs to
perfect.
go out.
All right. Well, on that note, Reno needs to go out. So, thanks everyone for your excellent questions and for attending our office hours.
Yeah, this was great. Lots of good questions.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.